Hey, good morning, folks. Welcome to a day of groundwater. And I think it's worth starting off asking the question I have often gotten when I've talked about doing this session at a salmon conference. Why are we talking about groundwater? And groundwater is, I think for some people who are in the room, totally get it. Others might be kind of curious. Maybe you're coming from a background thinking about groundwater in the more well-known arena of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, playing out in the Central Valley and other smaller Sigma basins in California. And I started out working on groundwater because I came to the Nature Conservancy about 8 years ago to work on streamflow restoration in our northern coastal streams. And my focus, the focus of work that I took over and continued to do for a number of years, was all focused on all these direct diversions. People with pumps in the stream, taking out water, and with a focus on that, we thought that we could restore stream flow to provide the ecological functions to be able to support the recovery of salmon. That was the theory of change. And in the Navarro River watershed, we did so much work that we got to the point where we were able to look at small tributary watersheds and add up all the known points of diversion. And then we could compare them to an unimpaired hydrograph and look at then our gauging that actually showed us what we had today. And when we looked at the difference between the unimpaired and the impaired and the estimated amount of direct diversions, there was a big gap of missing water, particularly in the dry season. And that's when we realized just how important groundwater was, and that we fundamentally are not going to be able to restore the ecological health of our rivers and streams that are particularly in our coastal watersheds that are super important for steelhead and for coho and for other fish and wildlife if we don't address the groundwater interactions. And so that has led to a lot of work that I've begun to do with David Dralle and others who are in the room, who have been working on this and probably are finally, being heard that groundwater is actually stream flow, and that without addressing our groundwater connection, we will not have stream flow. Because in the dry season, without snowpack in the mountains or something releasing water downstream, all the water we have in our streams is groundwater. A lot of people look at it and they're like, oh, it came from upstream. I'm like, yeah, water does flow downhill, but if you follow that up, eventually what you're going to find is that there isn't a spigot, and there's not a dam releasing water, hopefully, and there's no snowpack. So it's water emerging out of the ground, and so that stream flow is groundwater. So that's part of the reason why this is such an important session here at a fisheries conference. And I'll hand it over to Dave to talk about our presenters in the next couple of days.
Hey everybody, I don't like microphone. I'm David Dralle. I'm a research scientist with the Forest Service. I work at the Pacific Southwest Research Station. I remember like 7 or 8 years ago when I first started coming to SRF as an hydrologist, there was no specific kind of session focused on groundwater as a topic. And so I've seen that really emerge in this community over the last handful of years, and it's been exciting to me. Another piece about groundwater science at SRF to me that's like just really admirable and cool is how diverse the offerings are. We have people here who are building big models for withdrawals and managed aquifer recharge in the Central Valley. We have people who are, pumping water from kind of off-stream storage cisterns, ponds, etc., into small coastal streams to increase base flows during the dry season. We have people looking at diversions in smaller kind of groundwater valleys like in the Scott River system. And kind of like all that together to me encompasses like all these different kind of physiographic settings, big alluvial valleys, upland small headwaters, and people are doing the observations and seeing what's happening in our landscapes, but they're also like kicking the systems. They're pumping, they're putting in water, they're trying things. And as a person that has come from like an academic research background, it's really exciting from a learning standpoint to see how we can actively kind of intervene and fix a lot of the mistakes that we made, but do it in a way that's really informed, do it in a way that's based on science and observation. And I see so many people in the room that are doing that, and it's a pretty inspiring community to be a part of. And so the overall organizational kind of setup for the talks today, I think we did our best. It's not perfect, but we've kind of partitioned the talks this morning into a lot of more site-based, exploratory, data-based, observational type studies. That's not entirely true. There are people talking about policy this morning too. The afternoon is more of a larger scale kind of exploration of models and frameworks for understanding. Like Ted is going to open us in the afternoon with a model that's looking at diversions and pumping and impacts on water balance throughout the whole Central Valley and through a lot of alluvial systems in the state. So we're spanning all these scales. We're kind of trying to organize it in a sort of coherent way, so hopefully that works out. This morning we're going to start with Joel Monschke, and am I saying your last name perfectly? Okay, good. I realized I was like, I don't know if I've ever said it out loud before. And so I have a couple bios that I'll try and blast through. Joel's a California licensed civil engineer at Stillwater Sciences with expertise in restoration engineering, hydrology, and hydraulics. It keeps going. Engineering geology, geotechnical engineering, and geomorphology. Joel has directed and developed projects that upgrade public access infrastructure and enhance fisheries and aquatic habitat, including fish passage and flow enhancement. He's focused on the planning, design, and implementation of complex projects, including dam removal, flood control, fish habitat and riparian restoration, hydrological planning, groundwater recharge, landslide stabilization, and restoration effectiveness analyses. Joel has a BS in geological sciences from Stanford, and an MS in geotechnical engineering from UC Berkeley. Go Bears! And we're always really happy to see Joel and have him talk in our sessions. He's an awesome scientist, engineer, and yeah, welcome Joel. Thanks for signing up.
Thanks, David. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the Marshall Ranch project. I would like to thank my co-authors, David Sanchez is here, Marshall Ranch manager, Katrina Nystrom with SRF. She led the data collection on this project, a lot of the spot measurements that were collected last year. And Tom Hicks, water rights attorney, who helped facilitate many aspects of the project. So the presentation outline today is going to be starting with the background and setting. Then going into the project design and construction. The main focus is going to be on operations, monitoring, and adaptive management for the project. And then lessons learned and next steps. Down here on the bottom you can see a picture. This is taken last weekend. 5 million gallon off-stream pond, one of two at this site that are designed to release water into Redwood Creek during the dry season. So project location and kind of need. So this project is located in the town of Bryceland, which is along Redwood Creek, tributary to South Fork Eel. You can see the project location here in the middle of the watershed. This map is from CDFW, represents the salmon distribution in Redwood Creek. So you can see all three species occupying most of the watershed. And why flow enhancement? I think Monty touched on it earlier. We do have a lot of consumptive water use in this watershed, but we also have kind of a discrepancy between the consumptive water use and the expected unimpaired flows. Photo here showing June flows and August flows, and they just get worse from here. Definitely want to highlight the landowner here, the Marshall Ranch. The Marshall family of mixed indigenous and European ancestry has inhabited their Wailaki ancestral land from time immemorial to the present and has been actively involved in all stages of this project through development, construction, and operations. So definitely couldn't have gotten anywhere without landowner support. We had some challenging times along the way. David and Elizabeth here pictured were steadfast supporters of the project. So definitely want to give a shout out to them. Here you can see the Marshall Ranch, 3,000 acres approximately, located southeast of the town of Bryceland right here in the project. You could also see on this map a lot of other conserved land to the south, but this is Redwood Creek here, and there's a lot of private smaller holdings in Redwood Creek through the rest, so there is a lot of consumptive water use. The Marshall Ranch, kind of in parallel or just before this project, received or achieved a conservation easement with 3 state funders, a total of over $10 million to conserve the ownership. And so that was really instrumental. This project would not have happened without that conservation easement. Again, David was instrumental in pushing that forward, as well as Tom and several other consultants here. And definitely thanks to all the funders. So what is the Marshall Ranch Flow Enhancement Project? 2 5 million gallon off-stream ponds. This is the one we were looking at in that photo earlier. Here's a pre-project photo of the terrace where that project is located. 2 surface water diversions, so wet season only. These are passive gravity diversions located in 2 small tributaries that feed the ponds when flows are high. Managed flow release to Redwood Creek through either a direct release down here near Redwood Creek or a release into this cooling filtration gallery, which will be kind of the main topic of the last part of this presentation. Construction was largely completed in 2023, although we continued to tinker away at different pieces of it. And it was about a $4 million grant funded by WCB for implementation. Here you can see Redwood Creek pre-project, very dry conditions, little small pools here and there. So here's the project, kind of mid-construction, September 2023. Ponds are largely graded. You can see, interestingly, kind of this bluer material. This is bedrock, so it's a shale bedrock. We'll talk about that in the next slide, and that has a lot of implications for how the project functioned from a flow release through the infiltration gallery. Just for scale, obviously, you can see these pickups. We were actually doing a directional bore through this berm and hill slope for the flow release, so we could gravity feed out of the bottom of this pond. So geology, I think definitely want to highlight the importance of understanding the geology. I'm sure all of you know that, but it's pretty much the driver of most projects as far as how they're going to function and risk. And so Redwood Creek is really on the kind of messy intersection between coastal and central belt melange. It's primarily Yager and Wildcat formation, which, I think Yager is typically considered coastal belt, but it's really a mix. You can see here the more sandstone-dominated coastal belt geology and projects right here. We actually kind of mapped some Yager terrain that has a more central belt type of dynamics as far as the bedrock. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the immediate project vicinity is underlaid by mudstone shale, so pretty impervious layer, about typically like 15 to 20 feet below the ground surface. And then just as far as overall project functionality, we don't have any major losing reaches between the project and confluence with the South Fork Eel here. So the water that we put in, for the most part, is expected to travel along these 5.5 miles down to the Eel, South Fork Eel. Aside from, a few pumps and, about evapotranspiration. So here's the project today. Two full ponds. So these ponds are lined, HDPE liners, topped with about 8 inches of gravel. And so we, to try to improve longevity, we put the liner down, put some felt on top, and then put gravel on the top. And we were able to drive out on it with a small track skid steer to place that gravel, and have not had any issues with puncturing the liner. The project's designed to fill with 40 inches of rain, which is, about kind of drought conditions. Over the last 50 years, there have only been a few years with less rain. So this year and last year, which have been wet years, it's filled by, I think, mid to late February in both cases. We have a pretty complex monitoring setup with in situ telemetry system with 5 main locations: east and west pond, downstream, upstream, and cooling gallery. This is the cooling gallery input. We don't have any loggers there. We do have, and the water's coming directly out of the pond, so we know what's going in. So 2024 was our first flow release year, and immediately we ran into some early operational challenges. We had expected the ponds to stratify, and the west pond, which we wanted to release water from first because the water quality was a little bit clearer, did not stratify. And so it had water that was in the range of 70 plus degrees Fahrenheit, so over 22 Celsius, which is definitely way warmer than we wanted to release in the creek. So we used our cooling and filtration gallery right away. We had anticipated using it more in the late season, but July 1st we started releasing water. And so what is the cooling filtration gallery? This is kind of depicting it in engineered plans. Pretty simple. There was this gully running through the project site on a seasonal tributary, which already had hyporheic flow going through it. It would stay wet up here where it comes out of the canyon, and then it would go dry through this reach and would daylight back up here. So we knew we had kind of a natural hyporheic type flow condition. And we just filled the gully in with native material out of the pond excavation. We tried to use generally cleaner sandy gravel, but we didn't do anything special. Added a bunch of grade control, including a big one here at the bottom, and filled it with 6 feet or so of material. And then we just released water up here out of pipes. You can see kind of estimated bedrock here, filled about 6 feet, bedrock somewhere in the range of 6 feet below that. So consistent with the levels that we saw during the pond excavation. Here's some photos pre-project. Here, about a, say, 10 to 12 foot deep gully. Post-project here, filled in with about 6 feet of material. You can see some of the smaller grade control structures here. Here's just a picture of the flow release. So this is water coming out of the east pond. It runs a little ways down the gully and infiltrates. Here, this is just a schematic of our flow release over the course of the year, starting July 1st. The different colored dots represent kind of where we were releasing the water, but the blue line overall is how much water was released each day. So an average of 40 gallons per minute over 4.5 months. So really interesting was, how was the experimental cooling gallery going to function? And so there were definitely some nervous days in the beginning of July. And so here, this is our release point. Within a day, we saw water coming out of this French drain cistern. So stepping back a little bit, the ponds, you saw that picture of the drill rig up in this pond. We also did a similar bore from this pond, from the bottom of this pond out here to daylight near Redwood Creek. And so that drain both drains the pond, has a drain through the liner. It also has a French drain under the pond. So the first place we saw flow from our flow release was water traveling this direction, under this pond berm, into the French drain and coming out of the cistern. So we saw that water in about 12 to 18 hours. And it was 15 degrees cooler than the water we were putting in. So it was coming out at about 60 degrees or 16 Celsius. Then in about 2 to 3 days, we started seeing water daylighting here in the gully, kind of at the downstream extent of our larger grade control structure. And then kind of over the course of the next week or two, we started to see water daylighting at soil bedrock interfaces along this entire reach of Redwood Creek. And so those more diffuse flow paths were obviously much harder to measure, but we were able to pick up a significant portion in our downstream gauge, which is around here. Although we did see evidence of water, coming in even further downstream from our gauge. And so this green line kind of depicts the area that we think is most impacted by the groundwater levels. So just some more visual here. This is taken from kind of standing on top of the French drain cistern. Water's pouring out of that. Some water's coming down the gully. And then this is the flow release coming into Redwood Creek, I believe in July or August. And here is, just showing kind of the benefits of the cooling gallery. And this is taken in the French drain cistern. So this is the shortest flow path. There's a lot of longer flow paths that we believe are providing additional, probably more cooling over time because they're more soil, less flow. But you can see here, over 15 degree cooling effect initially, and then decreasing over time, but still significant. So stepping back to look at just kind of like overall project impacts, and then we'll dig back into some temperature implications and DO. But so the project, we started releasing flow on July 1st. You can see this purple here is the upstream gauge that was just upstream of our flow release. And that basically went dry in late July. So we lost surface flow connectivity. These are 3 other upstream gauges. They all lost surface flow connectivity at some point during the summer. And these are our downstream gauges, this group here. And so flow stayed connected. This is the most downstream gauge all the way down here, near the South Fork Eel confluence. It got pretty low by the end of the summer, but maintained connectivity. And just to look at other water years, this is RC 1.8, which is about a quarter mile downstream from the project. It had gone dry in every year from 2018 to 2024, including 2019, which is a very wet year. You can see it's kind of abnormally wet here with the declining limit of the hydrograph, much above the others, but it still went dry for a month. It's a very big alluvial gravel bar, and so a lot of hyporheic flow. But this year we were able to maintain flow above 10 gallons a minute throughout the summer. We did get kind of low here in mid-September, but we were watching all these gauges and adjusting flow accordingly. So that's kind of how the overall project functioned, but I think for this presentation, really looking at what were the impacts of that flow release into the groundwater. So this is SRF spot measurements, so measurements that Katrina and Chris with SRF took weekly at the project site. And then this is our in situ data. Obviously a lot of data here, but you can see the general trends are very consistent. So that was good. You know, we feel confident that we'll be able to rely more on the in situ data over time to really save dollars on long-term monitoring. Some interesting things, just a few key facts in this data. The east pond, so this kind of greenish, puke green, you can see it stayed pretty stratified. So this is at the bottom of the pond. It warmed up over the course of the summer, but the bottom of the pond stayed cool through middle of September, or early September. This is when we started releasing water from the east pond. Early season high water temperatures. So this is the upstream gauge. It really, actually maybe not this downstream gauge, the red. You know, we had period of high water temperature during the release, but this was really governed by just watershed processes, surface water, really warm temperatures. And so you could see that our flow release during this early July period was, you know, this blue here. So these warmer temperatures are not based on our flow release. Late season, so here, these are the downstream gauge. So you can see late season, we had very suitable temperatures for coho. Really, you know, after the surface water disconnected upstream. And we did see, up here is a little easier to visualize without all the noise. You know, as our flow release temperatures increased a little bit warmer than desirable, and again, this is just at the French drain outlet, we didn't really pick that up in the downstream gauge. It continued to decline. And so what we think is going on there is really just those more diffuse hyporheic flow paths are significant and offsetting, you know, this slightly warmer water, and then just the natural hyporheic flow coming down the creek from upstream is also cold. DO, definitely a very striking difference between upstream and downstream. This purple here is downstream, and then the blue is upstream. Purple is upstream, blue is downstream. So significant improvements in DO from upstream to downstream. And then you can see that our cooling gallery is, you know, it's not ideal for, it's coming out at about 4 milligrams per liter. So that's, you know, I think a little bit of a concern, something that we're definitely gonna watch, but I think as you know, get that water into the creek and it starts going through the normal kind of surface water, groundwater interactions in the creek itself, it normalizes to what would otherwise happen. One interesting thing is, you know, we have some aeration in our ponds, which don't matter a lot if you are putting water into the cooling gallery anyway, but it shows up like crazy. Turn those on and the DO in the pond skyrocketed, so you can see that here in this data. Downstream DO and temperature, really very similar trends to what we saw on the previous slides. Here we see temperature, again some spikes early in the season when you have a lot of surface flow, and this is the downstream gauge, so you know, a little more open channel down there warming up, but all these upstream gauges were you know, had a lot of flow or low temperature. And then here again, the comparison DO to upstream to all the downstream gauges is very striking. Fish, you know, how did the fish react? We didn't do a super in-depth survey, but definitely did a July and September snorkel surveys. We're planning to do more in-depth this year. and going forward. But you see here, this is the project site, two monitoring sites upstream of the project. July, snorkel, had some fish, no fish in September. It does appear that we have fish moving into the pools downstream of the project. And then, further downstream, definitely some fish either getting eaten or moving, but definitely fairly good survival. Summary and lessons learned. Project was very successful at achieving the overall objectives in the first year. We're real happy about that. The Hyporheic exchange coupled with flow augmentation seems to really be beneficial. And then, as I mentioned, kind of challenges of balancing DO and water temperature is going to be, I think, something that we refine going forward. Next steps, we have some system improvements to our monitoring system and our flow release system. Plan to start releasing flow again in July. Pretty standard monitoring again this year, although we're trying to ramp it up a little bit. And then in 2026, we want to do some, get some permits to do some dye tracer studies in the cooling filtration gallery to better understand kind of the residence time under the ground, flow paths, and then some fish growth and movement studies. And from a long-term ranch management perspective, this project has a lot of challenges with liability, regulatory hurdles, and really the long-term operations. We were able to get foundation funding to cover some of that, so that was really important. And then the use of the cooling filtration gallery really kind of changes the calculus from a long-term operations perspective because it provides a water quality buffer. And then we'll leave you guys with the Marshall Ranch's vision of multi-generational stewardship to protect and enhance ancestral lands in collaboration with good faith conservation partners. I think that's what made this project possible. And again, thanks to David and everyone who participated.
Well, good morning, friends. Get yourselves comfortable. We're going to go over to the Scott River. Eric Ginney, ESA, geomorphologist, come to this conference for a long time. Never been in this room, though, so welcome to the Dream Inn. Jason Wiener, my colleague, helped with a lot of this. I'm going to present some of his work that I did with him, but he crunched the numbers. If you want to know more about the details of this analysis, we'll get you all connected. This work, we have a contract with DWR to provide technical and regulatory assistance for flood-mar projects in California. So we're working from Merced in the south to Siskiyou County. That's where my perspective comes from. There's folks in here who know the Scott River way better than me. This was a paper study, get into that, but that's just the caveats. Acknowledging SVID for being on the front end of all of this, and Laura and others at Larry Walker are working. There's a Sigma thing going on in the Scott Valley. It's not just in the Central Valley, and they've been supporting the GSA up there. Also, my perspectives come from what I can find in the literature, etc. My understanding is, I'm interpreting a written history, and there are others who have other histories there, so that's my perspective here. There are folks who've been there a lot longer than any of us, and want to acknowledge that. So a quick overview, just to set some context, and appreciate the words from Monty and others on why are we doing this for fish. Talk a little bit about flood-mar, just explain what that is, talk about some of the challenges. That's essentially what I want to get out to you today, is there are some challenges in making this all happen. We'll talk specifically about the Scott Valley's flood-mar project. Really not going to focus on the work that we did. We learned some things. I'm just going to boil that down to kind of the methods and the results. We'll talk about what happened in 2024. It's just a good illustration of what these projects can do. and then end with some recommendations for what we think could be done to create some methods to get through some of these things and not do it on every single project, every single time, maybe 3 or 4 times or places in one watershed. Let's work on watersheds and find some approaches that can apply to the entire basin. So bottom line up front for you folks who know core planning speak, our takeaway is you can't use planning level models, you can't use hydrologic statistics to start thinking about the specifics of winter recharge in systems that have cell monods and passage issues, period. It's just not appropriate to do it in some of the ways that quote, we are thinking about it now. We did some eco-hydraulic and bioverification work in the Scott. It's what was available to us, but that's actually important, right? If the data is not available and you don't have a lot of money to go out and do an entire in-stream flow study, how are you going to figure out how to set a flow criteria that can be protective and also get some water in the ground? So we need to do it with what's available to us, and we think those are some of the techniques that are potentially available where you're at. And then going forward, the whole California Environmental Flows Framework, what's in there, some of the code that's been developed, some of that might also be helpful to integrate into a future methodology. So Scott River, I think almost everybody hopefully probably knows where that's at. Pretty amazing watershed without any dams. It's got some pretty important critters, and specifically we'll think about coho in this instance. At least that's what some of the feedback comments came back, suggesting we look at this more. Just kind of zooming in a little bit more, we've got this anomalous, you can just see from the color out of Google Earth, for those of us who fly around all the time. I don't know, the Scott Valley kind of sticks out to me along with the Shasta Valley. It's somewhat anomalous in the basin, and it's a bit of an important coho watershed. So zooming in more and more here, the little dot is the point of diversion. It's not on it is on the right, my bad. It's that tiny little red dot. Got your valley scale. This valley through time has been drained and simplified. I'll speak in gross terms. A lot of pasture, not a lot of row crops. This isn't the Central Valley. Looks a little bit red, but excuse me, the orange is the canal. Fort Jones gauge way down there at the bottom. A lot of detailed hydrology and all of this, but when you have a gauge at the bottom and you're trying to work on things throughout the reach, that's not always helpful. But that's a lot of what the water board's been looking at and others, and so probably not enough data here to make decisions readily. So going back in the Euro-American history, Beaver Valley, got Castor over there splashing around. I don't know, as a Northern Californian, I heard about Beaver Valley from a friend in college who grew up in Etna and just described the history, and I was fascinated by it, so I kind of geeked out on that for a little bit. But coming back to it, this is the pre-disturbance context here. So an incredible place with highly connected surface water, groundwater, and today we have a history of the cumulative impacts are well known to folks who are working in the basin and going to these talks. It's kind of the standard litany of things, including the decreasing winter snowpack, and there's some really interesting things looking at restoring some of the very old small reservoirs in the headwaters. Some interesting stuff going on. So our diversions down on the right, we'll show this image again, but just to get a sense of scale there, that's like a approximately 400-foot little yellow bar. And you can start to see the signs of agriculture. This is no longer a river that's well connected to its floodplain. Groundwater levels are down, and some images, late summer, autumn, flows like this are not great. So in theory, higher flows are necessary to support these species. So if we go with that premise, start thinking about things we can do, I believe that's kind of the early impetus for thinking about recharge projects. And sure enough, you look at the recovery plan and you see top stressor, altered hydrologic function, juveniles very high. It's a key limiting stress. So this is an important thing. So if we can get our groundwater levels back up to some extent, that would be good here in the Scott. And maybe I was going to make this point elsewhere, but I'll make it now. So Laura has done some work when she was at UC Davis, I believe it was in her grad work, and there are places in the Central Valley, like right where I live, if we recover, we're never going to recover groundwater levels to reconnect some of our creeks. It's pretty dismal. In the sky, modeling suggests if we can start doing more recharge, we may actually be able to recover groundwater levels and recreate a bit of function. So that's pretty cool. There's not a lot of places like that. So this is a diagram about floodmar. So what is floodmar? And some people call what's happening on this project agmar because we're using existing agricultural infrastructure to take some water off and spread that out on fallow ground or rooteral ground, whatever it might be. There's other, you can use recharge basins, etc. But that's kind of the diagram of it. And so, just to put a point on it, like this is the fisheries conference, we're trying to bring groundwater levels back up. I don't want to dive into how increased groundwater might be also used for agricultural purposes, whatever. That's not the point of this talk. This is what we can do until we can start to have broader process-based reconnections of the floodplain, right? So this is stuff we can do now with no regrets, get a jump start on things, try to bring groundwater levels back up, and through time, we all know it's going to take time and willing partners to do process-based restoration. So this is, I think, a no regrets action to start now. And so what's challenging about all of this is we're taking water out of a river, right? Like that's, in the Central Valley, that's the water wars, right? A lot of the thinking, and this is just my perspective, but a lot of regulators are used to regulating streams when we're at a time of scarcity, right? So declining limit of hydrograph, and you've got not enough, and you're making decisions on putting water out on the ground for crops or in stream flow. This is the winter, and we'll get into the flood hydrology, so it's a bit different. The Water Board has some guidance around 90-20, which is defined there. I'm not going to read that fourth large bullet for you, other than to say you can take water when things are quite high, the 90% exceedance, and you can take up to 20% of the flow during that time. You start looking at hydrology, it's like our diversions are so small relative to what 20% of our higher flows are. So my observation is it's a super conservative, it's based on some work that Brian Richter did, but it's not specific to California. It's rare I would probably say this, but it's a bit overly protected. It's just not set up to optimize for being protective of in-stream flows and also trying to get some winter water out on the ground. So back to Young's Dam, right there, it's laddered, it's screened. It's the first project, I remember hearing about this. I think Jay Lund maybe have shared some of the information on it early on. I was like, wow, that's some cool stuff. And it's been happening ever since as a pilot, an annual pilot. So annual water rights permits, 180-day, there's all this specific legal stuff, but that's kind of some of the hydrologic basics there on just how much could be diverted and what the maximum diversion rate might be. And so our charge here was to take a look at this because these are just some more details. I'm actually going to kind of bounce right through this because the geospatial doesn't matter so much. It's really thinking about the diversion of that red dot. So this project wasn't using 90-20. I'll show a hydrograph here in a moment. Forest Service has this interesting water right on the Scott, presumably for beneficial in-stream use. It's for 440 CFS. And so, as sometimes happen, people grabbed onto that, and I think that was the consensus of let's do it that way back in 2016, 17, what have you. This is the point I was going to make. I forgot I had this slide. I'm going to bounce through this. This is basically saying that this project has shown some recovery. We'll get into the results, but that was the point I was going to make, and apologies for doing that out of order. So the new information was related to a CDFW report. It's the one down there. Some folks might be super familiar with this, but was trying to get at what can we do to set in-stream flows, and the winter in Streamflow they came up with was 362 during that time period. And some folks said, hey, that's lower than 440. Should we maybe be using that instead of 440? And so around the same time, we're on a contract to support anyone who's doing a project like that. We got roped in and said, hey, could you take a look and see if that's a protective flow? And at the same time, they said, and how much more water might we get? And sure enough, actually reducing flow from 440 to 362 means a lot more water could have been diverted for recharge. If you keep going down and down and down and take more and more water, around 230 doesn't really yield any more benefit, by the way, and that's that optimization that we probably ultimately want to look at, but we were just going to look at 362. And so there you have the 362 optimum in gray up there. You can see the 440 from previously. And then also on this, just because there's lots of information in the Scott, there were emergency decrees and other things that are on there. I don't want to get too into that, but our target was to essentially just look at this. It's a pretty simple question. Someone asked me a poster session question yesterday, and I said, that's not what we were asked to do. It was very simple. Just, is there anything to support this? So we took a look first what was done to set this 362. It was also a paper study. And when you look at the methods, it was never intended for prescriptive use without some form of validation. And so we said, we should probably take a look closer at this. And it's good paper. It says, this is what we did, and this is how you should not misapply our work. So we thought we should take a look at what we can do. It's definitely an optimum. It was not meant to create a minimum in-stream flow. And of course, we had no budget to go and collect data and do an in-stream flow study. So we took a look at our reach there, which is lit up in the blue, looked at these species. Adult migration is the specific component that's important in terms of life histories. And boiling down our two methods. The first was taking a look at some existing information, LiDAR, a whole variety of things. It was a desktop exercise, not hydraulic modeling, but we took at every junction in our analysis where we could be conservative, we were conservative, and we kept doing that all the way through. So we feel like for a desktop exercise, critical riffle analysis, we thought it was about the best you could do with never going out and doing new survey work. We also had some local professionals, Sari Sommerstroms up there. I don't know if we got data from Betsy, a whole variety of folks, biological observation data, some photos later. We basically compared wherever there was a data point that suggested fish were in the system and had moved through critical points, and we calibrated that against flow and just took a look at what it showed us. So, for passage analysis, and when we say provided nearly unimpeded passage, gets into the details again, being super conservative at every critical riffle. We found that flows even lower than 362 would work. And then the interesting one, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but down to 100 to 200 CFS seemed to consistently enable coho to migrate through the areas. And this is a summary of a long paragraph of information, but it all seemed to suggest that this 362 would be good to go. So just a little bit about the project, and I think it's important to share. Previous talk was essentially sharing all about, so what, about getting water into the ground or back into a creek or river. In 24, this was about 2,700 acre-feet of water diverted, and it was spread out across about 260 acres. There's a diagram of where that all happened, along with some monitoring wells. A whole variety of things are being monitored up there by LWA team with local folks making observations. Pretty robust set of monitoring, but just to look a little bit at the diversion hydrology and then the results. On groundwater, you can see the diversion, and you should never just look at something and say, I don't think that makes a difference, but it was striking when I first saw it plotted. The diversion relative to 440 and then the diversion relative to the hydrograph, getting up into 1,500 to 2,000 CFS consistently through a time period, a relatively small amount of water, right? So haven't done any work with the components of the hydrograph and Ceph and so forth, but as professionals, you look at this and it's a pretty strong signal. It's a relatively small amount of water. So one of the monitoring wells, starting to look at the information. What we don't want to see is that just groundwater levels are rising because the river is rising and we have water losing laterally, right? So when recharge is happening and we're seeing recovery far from the river, we're starting to get a sense that our project, which is spreading water from the ditch out, right? It's just turning out water through a network of spreading water for folks who spread water with a shovel and whatnot. And you can see precipitation and recharge down below. So folks feeling like this was pretty effective in this particular year. And I haven't updated the presentation. I believe they've done more work with later season. This was through February 19. And we'll let other folks at other conferences that are happening this year tell the groundwater story a bit more. But this was essentially a good outcome for them in terms of 12 feet of increase. My opinion is just through time we need to start really paying attention to how much of a late season benefit we're getting, and that's work, right? That's just work to be done. So another talk. That's not this talk. So just to wrap up, we've been working on these projects all across the state, and everybody just acknowledged we don't have many of our federal or state partners here right now, and so felt like it was somewhat safe to not start out with, this is not to bash the state board at all. There's great folks there, but the current guidance is 90-20, and it's not working well for the outcomes we all want to see. So it seems simple, but no one has actually formally, to my knowledge, recommended a new methodology, and so that's something let's start pushing that direction. And there's a couple roads we can go down, and we think based on this work and some other work in other watersheds, let's not mess with statistical hydrology. Let's get into something that is more place-based, right? And let's set it up for an entire anadromous reach or entire watershed, so that Project 1 doesn't do their work, and then Project 2 is wanting to take away from what Project 1 might be able to accomplish, right? Like, let's not start project wars going through time. Let's think about the watershed and set something that's protective and let folks work on that through time. I mentioned Ceph, and Sarah and other folks are around. There's probably talks this afternoon that are going to get in more to the California Environmental Flows Framework. We think, let's leverage all of that. Let's put things in context there. This is stuff that Jason's been doing a lot more on, so his work helped folks consider how much, it's a water availability analysis basically, and getting into the method, which I'll show here as my last slide, being able to do optimization modeling around what's protective and what's going to get the most water in the ground. Like, that's truly the balancing that we need to do, and let's focus less on the biology, let's figure that out, and then let's start figuring out optimization schemes. So this is, I don't know, we had a task order with DWR. The state budget was not what we all had hoped it was going to be. I don't know if folks have seen things are getting better, but there's not a lot of water, never water or money. There's not a lot of money in Sigma right now to focus on this work. A lot of that money's been expended, and Prop 4 is not really focused on that. So we developed a task order, boiled it down into 7 bullets. We're starting to talk to the conservation community about how we could start working on this together, because the state's Floodmar Technical and Regulatory Assistance Program ends on December 31st of this year. Get the same timer. We need to work on this. Somebody pointed out to me, there's a Floodmar forum happening. It happens every 2 years. It's going to happen again this fall. Especially in the Central Valley, where in San Joaquin, there aren't even flood flows until the wettest of wet years. If we're not ready, and it takes us 2 to 3 years to figure this all out, what if we're in a dry spell? Now it's 6, 7 years before we're diverting water out of whatever creek. We need to move much more quickly on resolving these things, not having, getting a temporary 180-day permit for a winter diversion taking 2 years. That's kind of what's happening right now. So we just want to leave you with a sense of urgency around this kind of work. And I believe that animal is not living in this photo, to my knowledge, but it was just one of those things when you're going through your work, I'm like, that is a beautiful, beautiful fish. So I'll leave you with that one. We want to see more of this. I like how there's snow on the ground. It makes me happy on the skier. And with that, I'll take any questions if y'all have them. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for coming. I can't say how wonderful it is to be presenting to you all today. I just love this conference. From the top of the slide, just a couple of comments. If you know me as Chris Hammersmark from CBEC Eco Engineering. We've been acquired. We're in the process of transitioning to Verdantis. The next time I talk with you at SRF, I'll be up here presenting as Verdantis Eco Engineering. The next thing you might notice is, hey, that's not the title that was in the abstracts. I'm really sorry, that talk is not quite ready. I look forward to presenting it next year. It'll be much better if I have one more little bit of data to fully fill that out. Moving down, I'm the one who has the opportunity to share this cool tool with you. It has been a team at CBEC working over a decade to build it up to the point we're at. So the credit is not due to me. I will first take the opportunity to preach to the choir for a little bit, sort of set up why we have a need for this type of approach. I'll then walk you through the EcoFIP methodology. Actually, I guess I should go back since you didn't see my title previously. I'll be presenting on the ecological floodplain inundation potential toolbox that we've developed at CBEC. We call it EcoFIP. So I'll set up the project, I'll talk about the EcoFIP methodology, and if I've left enough time, I hope to show a couple of applications at the end. So, reach into the choir. Our presence on the landscape has really left to many of the ecosystems being in a very degraded state. We've gotten there through confining rivers by levees, by damming rivers, by diverting flow, the list goes on and on. We've also deforested vast areas, changing hydrology and sediment inputs, and mined within river channels. Many of you are very, very familiar with those impacts. At the same time, the infrastructure that is on the landscape is aging and failing, and the flood risks ahead of us, the climate is getting a little bit more aggressive. And so the floods are getting bigger right at a time when most of our infrastructure is really sort of ready to retire. And unfortunately, often it's the less disadvantaged, or the less advantaged folks of us that are bearing the biggest brunt of these impacts. When we look to projects, the days of a single objective are long, long gone. We need to check a lot of boxes for a successful project these days. Some of the objectives and solutions can include habitat uplift. They can include flood risk reduction. They can include transient water storage, both on the surface of a floodplain to help attenuate flood waves, as well as encouraging aquifer recharge. In other parts of the state and some parts of this state in the north, nutrient reduction is a really big motivation that we're looking to floodplains to help us solve. Through my career, I've had the opportunity to work on a number of really amazing projects with some really, really great project partners. I'll highlight a couple of projects on the American and Yuba rivers where we've primarily focused on salmonid habitat enhancement. In these projects, we've excavated aspects of the active floodway to create side channels. Here's the lower Sailor Bar project on the American River, where we implemented a side channel and several spawning riffles. Here's the Hallwood project on the Yuba River, where we removed 3.2 million cubic yards of sediment from the floodway to let the river start being a river again. Or here's Ansel Hoffman project on the American River, where we lowered the floodplain to create an alcove to provide lower energy environments for juvenile salmonids to rear in. we take that material and we place it in the channel to create spawning riffles. Here's an example on the American River just below Nimbus Dam. And here's another example on Upper Rose Bar on the Yuba River, where these are some initial spring run coming in to start spawning in this area where there wasn't suitable spawning habitat previously. But I would lie to you that if I said that in those projects, which have grown to be programs, we knew exactly what we were doing at the beginning, and we knew we were working at the best spot on the first time. It's often very opportunistic. And so many times when I pitch a project, they're like, well, how do we know this is the best place to do that project? Is this really where we should be spending our dollars? Well, that's the motivation for developing the tool that we've developed. And so there's so many sites. We're trying to optimize multiple objectives. We're trying to maximize uplift while we minimize costs. There's always a ton of stakeholders involved. And sort of at the very bottom of all of this, where do we have willing landowners? Where can we play? And often a big part of the problem is that we have tools that can start getting at some of these answers. They're the traditional tools engineers have used for decades. We have hydraulic models, for example, a large-scale 1D model like HECRAS. We can simulate flows of various levels and see where it would inundate. That's sort of a first step. But it's usually confined by levees or other elements on the landscape that are restricting what the potential for inundation is. And so in sized or levee systems, we're not seeing the full potential. And it's difficult to identify areas that could be modified to provide ecosystem services. And so this is really the fit part, which we built on top of, the floodplain inundation potential. And so early efforts peeled away those levees, projected out the floodwaters to see, well, this is what could be inundated if there wasn't a levee in this situation, or if there wasn't high ground or other obstructions to the flow. Another part of the problem is the hydraulic models are really good at looking at, say, a peak flow rate or steady state conditions, but it becomes computationally intensive to look at long periods of time to be able to integrate sort of ecosystem benefits across various water years to get to a more nuanced answer rather than, well, at 10,000 CFS, this is how many acres we might inundate. And so one approach that we've taken to addressing that is we often look at a series of steady state flows, sort of snapshots, and then kind of integrate across those to be able to estimate what the potential benefits of actual varied flow are. And it allows us to look across a water year, tens of water years, to really get a bigger picture rather than trying to just look at specific key index flow values. So this is sort of the start of EcoFit. EcoFit is a multi-tiered analysis toolbox that we've developed at CBEC. It starts in tier 1 at a very large spatial scale, looking at a reach or even river-wide level to identify areas that could be potentially inundated. At this point, we are just looking at individual flows. You can decide what flow you want to look at. It could be the 1.25-year flow, could be the 2-year. You sort of set where you think it's important. But that gives us the very first step, the floodplain inundation potential. Then we zoom down. Once we see where areas could be flooded, we then are able to look at another granular scale. That could be at the parcel level, it could be at a gridded level, it could be by river mile, but zooming in, where is the best potential to be doing these types of projects? And then once we identify where the most potential is, then we're able to move into tier 3, where we're actually rapidly developing conceptual designs for what a project might look like. I'll sort of walk through tier 1 here. We have a DEM in the background, which is the Wabash River, which runs between Illinois and Indiana. And we've got a typical 1D sort of look here where we've got cross sections. So we have a DEM and a hydraulic model. With that, we can simulate a flood of any value or any level. In this instance, we're choosing a lower, more frequent flood and establishing a water surface elevation that kind of becomes our new datum. In some ways, we're sort of detrending a DEM relative to this water surface elevation to then calculate height above river. And this is something that we've all been doing for quite a while. It's a first cut at, well, how much material would we have to remove to be able to inundate a certain area? Or how deep would it be at this type of flow? And so this is a real generalized schematic here where a height above river is positive if you've got land that would need to be removed to get you down to that inundation level. And conversely, it tells you the depth that flow might achieve in various areas. And so then one of the outputs of tier 1 is the depth, the potential depth over floodplain areas. But it also then tells us that's the whole potential. This is the areas, so these brown areas here. I screwed up. There we go. So these brown areas could be inundated, but they're actually disconnected by the current topography. So another output of tier 1 is activation thresholds. Okay, what flow would it take to get this inundated under its current topographic condition? And what is actually being inundated now? So again, what is the potential versus what do we actually see? And again, in an automated process, it goes through and churns out all of these results that, previously we would do all of these steps by hand or by computer, but not in an automated fashion. And that's one of the great things about EcoFit is to sort of bundle it all together so that we can churn through this serial step of analyses that we've done on many projects, but now in a very, very efficient way that we can look at tens and hundreds of miles of streams very rapidly. So just a quick panel here to show you a little bit about tier 1. And this is going to step through various flows and then step back down again. And so now we've moved back to somewhere closer to us. We're looking at a section of the Sacramento River. In the first panel, we have the water surface elevation. Then the next panel over, we have the height above river at various flows, the depth that's achieved, what's connected and what's disconnected. And then if you can characterize your habitat based off of depth metrics, you can input habitat suitability criteria and have it spit out what the potential habitat suitability is for any of these potential areas. Again, Sacramento River, same stretch, but now turned 90 degrees. It steps through and shows us at what different flow rates activation would occur, and then it steps back down again, identifying areas where, say, stranding could occur. So at what flows do things disconnect if we're ramping down hydrographic? So we've used this on a number of reaches on the Sacramento River to identify potential fish stranding areas that could be addressed. Now stepping into the next tier. So that was the reach scale, even river scale. Now, okay, well, where should we work? Well, depends on what you want to do. And EcoFit allows us to quantify benefits now at sort of, let's call it a parcel scale or a grid scale. And so this example on the right here, we're back over in Indiana, and we're looking at potential waterfowl habitat acre days. And so now we're stepping from just looking at individual flows to then integrating anytime we care about duration. And so here we have potential habitat acre days on this landscape. I'll just forward to show that's what's actually happening now. You know, the little bright colors, and otherwise these areas are disconnected and not being inundated, whereas this is the potential out there. And you can grade them based off of different metrics to then understand which sites have the most potential. For each parcel that you define, so imagine any one of these polygons, we develop a flow area curve that then allows us to to calculate metrics on a effectively cell by cell or parcel by parcel basis to understand what the potential of any one of these fields or parcels could be. With that, we can then calculate the duration of inundation, we can calculate habitat metrics like acre days, we can estimate the amount of potential recharge that would occur. Monty's looking at me, this is my tie to groundwater. I'm in the wrong session, but I'm groundwater adjacent. And we can do that over, we can calculate these things for any given water year, or look across a wide range of water years to then simplify it down to, well, here's the average that you would get in any given year, because oftentimes we have to simplify problems down to be able to make decisions. Frankly, when I'm given 600 results and saying which one's best, I'd look for a way to simplify that, to be able to really make decisions. I just showed you parcels. You can also look at it in a gridded framework. In this instance now, this is showing us the darkest green, what areas would be the best place to provide waterfowl habitat. And so that can also target land acquisition, or if you're working in an area that isn't all chunked up with various properties, where should we be targeting our actions? What makes the most sense? And we can analyze many, many different metrics. This is a plug-and-play aspect of the model. Frankly, we initially started with acre days of inundation with a salmonid rearing habitat sort of context. We then layered on potential recharge. We're now in the Midwest adding nutrient reduction models to say, well, if you restore this area, this is the type of nitrogen and phosphorus reduction that you could achieve. We have much different motivations there than we have here. We're also starting to add, well, what's the potential for cottonwood recruitment? Because it's similar types of things where you're looking at rate of change, it's an unsteady problem, but we can look at, well, how deeply was it flooded? How slowly is the surface dropping down? And so this is an application that we're just starting to look into, but it's very tunable to whatever your objective might be if your objective is driven by how deep and how long is water on the landscape. One thing that's also really nice is we don't just have to look back at history and say, well, if we'd done this, this is how it would have worked out. We all understand we're operating under very different hydrology. Looking backwards isn't telling us a lot about looking forward. And so we can input different outputs from climate change models to be able to say, well, under this condition, these are the type of benefits we might be able to achieve. And so we're not stuck just looking in the rearview mirror. Now stepping down to tier 3, once we've actually identified, hey, these are the best spots. These are the ones where we should really be thinking about doing anything. First, we've selected the areas. So here, this is an example of the upper San Joaquin or San Joaquin River, Reach 1A, so just downstream of Bryant. And here's potential areas that have been identified through other criteria, willing landowners, inundation potential, the various metrics that I talked about. We then build a library of potential rehabilitation actions. You can think about it as a menu. This is an ever-growing menu, and they're very project-specific depending on what types of things are contemplated. Types of things could be grading down to a certain elevation so that the floodplain gets inundated at 1,000 CFS, at 4,000 CFS. You could include channels or alcoves that, again, inundate at different thresholds. You can look at levee setbacks or flood attenuation basins. There's all sorts of management actions that can be included in here, and then the model, in a fairly automated way, can go through and develop initial concepts. And this isn't like the old days where we're actually doing this grading in CAD and then evaluating in a model. This is all happening in the code, and it's spitting out initial potential concepts. Are they all amazing? No. Are they a good place to start talking? Absolutely. And then we iterate on them as they come out. We then refine the concepts, talking with our project partners. It's like, oh, well, we could do a side channel in this area. They're like, oh, well, let's think about this. Or maybe that needs to be narrower than the first cut. And so we can refine what they look like working with project partners. And then again, in a very automated way, we can churn out cost and benefit analyses for the different projects, which is again really where the rubber hits the road. Like how much budget do we have available? What can we achieve? All right, how can we identify what project is? And you can even then sort of cycle back and go to a different iteration if, oh, well, that's too much. That's going to require too much material to be removed. Finally, once we work through that process, then that identifies a project that can be advanced to a 30% design. At this point, we don't have the computer able to do this piece. This is where we have to get involved, because now we're taking things from concept and actually, working into reality. So here's an example of tier 3. Now we're on Salsipuedes Creek, which is a tributary to the Pajaro River, about 25 minutes that way. This is Watsonville here on the edge, and this is an area where the Corps has been contemplating a flood risk reduction project for quite some time. It has moved very slowly over decades and now is starting to move very fast. It's a little bit of a whiplash. In this particular area, they knew they wanted to implement a setback. That was part of the flood evaluation. They knew they needed material and they wanted to dig it out of the floodplain in this area, but they had no idea what the hole should look like. We said, oh, this would be a great opportunity for us to show you how EcoFit works. We're working with their Engineering with Nature group on larger Pajaro opportunities, but this was sort of just out of the gate like, oh, we can help with that. We can help with that fast. And so they said, we need X thousand cubic yards of material. Okay, we can work with that. We put it into the model. Model comes up with a concept, which we then refined subsequently. But here's existing ground, here's a cross section. It's a side channel with some floodplain benches. But instead of just achieving the amount of material they needed, we now could quantify what's the potential recharge benefit of that. How much salmonid habitat might come out of that? And so we're able to incorporate some of the other objectives and metrics to be able to guide this. We turned this around in about 27 hours. They were like, wow, fantastic. Within a week, it was their design that they're implementing at this time. And so it's this type of really nimble process that actually makes it really fun. So you don't have to spend 20 years talking about doing something. You can get to where you're talking about it and able to implement it very rapidly. So here's just, actually this next one is just an example of that site and now how it wets up compared to a pre-project condition. So again, Salsquith's Creek, this is how it inundates from 50 CFS up to 5,500 CFS under the existing condition, and how it will inundate once the project is implemented. And again, perfect. And again, there's all sorts of metrics that we can derive from those initial results. We've had the opportunity to apply this across the state, and now we're applying it across the nation. It started in California with a lot of work with Department of Water Resources. We've applied it in all of the San Joaquin tributaries at this point. We're currently applying it on the Sacramento River. We're working on the Feather River as well. As I mentioned, we're working with DWR and the Corps on the Pajaro River, right close to us here. And we've also started applying it in the Midwest, working with the Nature Conservancy, where they have a huge nutrient problem. They don't know where to get started. We're able to look at hundreds of miles to say, well, these are really the spots that make the most sense for you to do a floodplain action if nutrient reduction is your primary motivation. We've set this all up in a user-friendly GUI that it isn't just the initial coder of EcoFit that can do this work. Now, analysts at CBEC are able to take outputs and generate all of the stuff that I showed you today. And so it's a tool that can be used by many. Not every, but many people. And we're constantly adding river miles, looking at other areas, and layering on, like my Cottonwood example, other things that we can quantify with this to help inform potential benefits from projects. With that, I will thank you for listening and entertain any questions you might have.
Good morning, and as we drove down the highway and we went over the hill and saw Scotts Valley, I realized that I needed to insert a little note in my presentation that indicated that we're talking about Northern California, Scott River and Scott Valley, which if you were here earlier, you got a little orientation as to the location. As with all of these projects that we all do, and particularly in my home community, it's a team effort. It's the other members of the Scott River Watershed Council and all the funders and permitters and everyone else, and most primarily landowners, because it's a private landscape that the fish are living in. So water quantity, in my mind, is the major limiting factor for the success of our species. It's a little known fact that if you have no water, you don't have any fish. So that's the focus of my talk. And there's increasing interest in how much water is required. There's increasing agricultural demands, there's drought, climate change, and then as a result of all those factors, there's increasing regulation that's affecting my community. And with regulation, you need standards and numbers, which we talked about a little bit just in the last session about how much winter flow is needed. So there is a regulation, 5937, that's in regards to flow beneath dams and diversions to keep fish in good condition. But that was a loose term, keep fish in good condition. What does that mean? Moyles, all the way back in 1998, attempted to define that. And there's sort of the immediate, fat, happy fish. That's a good fish in good condition. And then a population level are their life species. And both of those, all life stages represented. And both of those have been studied somewhat extensively, but that last definition, the community definition that says on a larger scale, on a watershed or even a basin, you need flows and conditions that allow fish to move and thrive on that level. And I see Suzanne back in the room. She's done some really excellent work on that second level. But that third level is so dynamic and multifactorial that it's difficult to tackle. So we're going to move to the Scott and talk about that. This is not hard science. This is based on a local, place-based interaction with the environment and the fish and the flows over now quite an extended period of time. There's lots of data that we'll talk about in a minute, but why is the Scott so important? It is a source population of an essentially hatchery-influence-free population of coho, for sure. I don't know the genetics on the Chinook, and I've been trying to track that down. But as we look at this whole new upper basin that's been opened up, having this vital and vibrant source population is critically important if we're interested in hatchery-influence-free fish, which we talked a lot about over the last couple days. And again, there's this increasing regulatory pressure to define whether we need 440 in the summer, or winter, or much less than that, and then certainly base flows, how much water is really essential. As mentioned, there's a lot of data out there. Actually, the Scott is pretty intensively studied. We have that gauge at the bottom of the alluvial agricultural valley before the river, or as it enters the canyon. That has a very long period of record and is a good, statistically valid and calibrated and all that. We have the Scott Valley Integrated Hydrologic Model, which has been developed over the past 15 or 20 years by Laura Foglia and the UCD team, and it's been peer-reviewed. So that's a really data-rich and well-developed source. And then we have sort of some of the softer sciences. We have a CDFW connectivity survey, which for the last couple of years, someone's driven around and taking a picture at every publicly accessible location on the tributaries. And this is an attempt to start trying to calibrate that downstream gauge to what's happening in the tributaries, which, that's not a well-correlated knowledge source. And then we have things like spawning surveys and juvenile direct observation and pit tagging. Again, these are not randomized, stratified sample themes because we're dependent on landowner access and willingness. But it is starting to be an interesting amount of information about how fish are using our watershed. What I'm not going to talk about today, but other people touched on, is why are flows so low. I'm going to give you data about what they are doing. Got placed in the groundwater session. I kind of went, well, I'm not really talking about groundwater, but some minds wiser than mine know that the Scott is a groundwater-dependent ecosystem altogether, and so you can make your own inference about agricultural water extraction in combination with drought and so on affecting these flows. and I'll make a couple references to that. So again, here's the Scott. You saw it a little bit earlier. You see the canyon. It comes up from the Klamath through this very, mountainous canyon. The spawning weir, where we're looking at adult returns, is all the way up there, almost to the alluvial reach. You see the green, lush agricultural valley, which, if you go on OpenET and cruise around, you'll see that, yes, we're using a lot of water consumed to produce that lovely green landscape that personally I really enjoy. And then separating the upper 20% of the watershed is the residual Yuba dredge tailings, which annually dewater. And with these changes in the hydrograph, that dewatering extends more and more into the spawning migration season, and we'll see a little bit of the effects of that. And overlaid on that, you see the blue lines, which are the documented extent of anadromy, and they very closely correlate to all those lands that people like. Apparently, beavers, people, and fish all like the same kind of landscape. So I'm going to talk about Scott Chinook a little bit. On the top, you have, since 1978, through that spawning weir, the population returns. And I'll point out, this just goes through 2023. Last year, we had about 800 animals coming through that weir, as compared, to the historic numbers up there in the 10,000 or so. And the average is now somewhere around under 4,000 animals. The Scott population is declining, as is the Klamath population, but they used to be kind of in tandem. And you can see the Scott Chinook returns there in blue and the Klamath in red. But what's happened over the last 10 or so years is we've decoupled from the Klamath overall population, and we're declining at a faster rate. So what's different? What's going on? I'm going to point out that Chinook, for the return for spawning, they're tied to the calendar. Somehow they have the clock ticking, and they're going to come or try to come in no matter what the flows are. Their return for spawning is not a flow-triggered spawning. And you can see that in that representational graph in the bottom, which the black lines being the coho returns and the hydrograph being the red. And you can see, they're not hanging around for that hydrograph. They're going to come through the weir. And these beautiful graphs and information are from Morgan Kneckley and his team at CDFW, and I'm appreciative of him sharing them. So now we have a graph showing the decline in September, which is when the Chinooks start trying to come in. And that's the trend line since 1941 at the USGS gauge. And you can see that's not a very positive trend line. And I have the numbers for the averages. The average over the whole period of record is 45 CFS. But if you look back to the average from 1942 to 1975, which is around the time when the valley agriculture started converting from surface diversion to pumping and groundwater diversion, the average prior to that was 62 CFS, and now in the last 10 years, our average is 15 during that initiation of the Chinook migration. And you might notice that that graph trend line is not terribly dissimilar to the trend line on the Chinook population during the same period of time. Chinook diverse life history diversity strategy to overcome this rigid timing according to calendar is that they have adults returning at 3, 4, 5, 6, or a wide age span. So if you have a year's drought and they can't come in and spawn, well then they'll come back as a significant number. But if you have these 10 consecutive years of really low flow, you start losing the ability of that life history strategy to overcome the insult of a drought year. So let's look at that in terms of where fish are spawning. So again, we have that counting station, that red bar right there. And this is the years. The white lines there are good to average water years, and then the dark lines are the known drought years there. And what we have in this column is the percent of fish that come through the spawning, the counting station versus the total estimated return. That total is derived from spawning surveys in addition to the number of animals coming through the spawning weir. So it's a calculation of how many fish are in the total system, and what we're looking at is how many are spawning up in this preferred spawning area, their historical spawning areas, versus down here in the canyon. And you can see in the drought years, 71 wasn't too bad. In 22, only 7% of the fish were able to make it through the spawning weir up into this preferred historical spawning reaches. So that starts affecting, spawning success. Oh, wrong button. There we go. Let's see if this will play for you. All right, I hope you can see that. Those are those Chinook in the canyon trying to get through that boulder field there with really low flow. And then we're going to look. There's that barrier right up there. Okay, they're showing it to us. Let's look downstream. And to me, there you go. Those are the fish that are unable to get up through that barrier. And they will be driven to spawn. They have that timing driving their behavior. They're going to spawn in the canyon, superimposition of reds, and then in winter flows, this is just a fire hose, and so red loss is very high. All right, we're going to move on to coho. Coho, as most of you know, they come back pretty rigidly every 3 years. So we have a cohort here. This set of fish will, their progeny will come back and spawn here, and so on. So a 3-year cycle. Unlike the Chinook, the coho can hang out and wait for flow to drive their return. So there's a little bump in the hydrograph here. We get some fish coming through the weir, a real significant bump in the hydrograph there, and boom, they're through there. So they can hang out and wait, and then they're going to respond to flow. So let's look at that. Here's our total population over time. And here's this cohort, 1,600 animals, 927. Yay, we're recovering the fish, woohoo! But then the drought of 2015, and look at what happens in the return from that. So these fish had trouble getting into tributaries. The coho are tributary spawners. So the flows come up, they can get into the main stem, but then connectivity to the tributaries is a critical factor for them. So they were forced to spawn in the main stem of the Scott River up in the alluvial valley, but still not ideal for them. And then those juveniles had to oversummer in very dire, low flow, hot, terrible conditions. On the other hand, we have a cohort here, which seems to be making some pretty steady progress. So, maybe we're okay. But they're pretty cycled into returning every 3 years. So potentially we could lose one whole cohort moving through time and have 2 others that are hanging on. So again, the comparison of the hydrograph to population, that drop-off is not as steep and not as dire. A coho prefer to start coming back in November. And so you're looking at it and you're thinking, okay, well that's not too bad. We look at our average over here, 143, okay, we're hanging on and doing good. But you look here in the drought years, and we have, during the November return, the initiation, flows that are down, sub 30 CFS, and they're not getting up either. And again, now we're going to look at the spatial distribution implications of that reduced access to to preferred spawning habitats. This time we're looking at tributaries versus the main stem up here. And again, coho, their red success, egg to fry emergence and all that is much better if they're spawning out in the tributaries. And right about here is where that barrier, that tailings barrier is. And then up here we have the main stem. So here we have a pretty dire water year, and we had 26% of the counted reds up in the main stem, and we virtually had none on all of these tributaries here, as compared to a good water year where only 8% of the identified reds were in the main stem, and we had pretty good spatial distribution there. So you might overall have some good flow during the return, but the timing is critical both for the coho and Chinook. And I'm just giving you a graphic representation of what that looks like with the very concentrated spawning here in the main stem, here in the main stem, and really only one tributary open for the coho spawning. And then in a really nice water year, we have those fish being able to distribute themselves across the landscape and giving themselves all those opportunities for success. So I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper. This was another good water year. And we have nice distribution of spawning. Here we have the hydrograph. This is the average. And here we had a really nice spike in November, and we're able to get fish up into those tributaries all over the place. Here's an example. You'll look at French Creek during a drought year in a minute, but this was during that nice flow. By the way, there is some restoration going on there, which pumped water over onto the floodplain, and we had lots of nice pools, and the fish could get all over the place. I'm going to go back a minute. Here's Noise Valley Creek, which is well above that tailings barrier here. These are very low gradient reaches up here, really nice. And during this great water year, we were able to extend the documented extent of coho spawning over a mile, or just about a mile. And here we are in 2022, drought year, installing piezometers in December, and then in December of 2024, here we have fish spawning there. So again, this is just an example of the difference of flow in the ability of fish to express themselves across the landscape and achieve that landscape level of resiliency. And that is in partnership with the Wildlands Conservancy, who bought that property. So going back to a drought year, here's that French Creek, and it is exhibiting basically summer baseflow conditions during that winter when the fish should be out there spawning. And we did get highly concentrated spawning in French Creek, again with superimposition of reds and so on. Our hydrograph here is showing, really 10 CFS there at the gauge. You have drought, but restoration can help mitigate, and we have this bad drought year, and we're looking at the progeny of those fish that had to spawn in less than ideal situations. And what did I do here? Can you?
Maybe just went to sleep.
Thank you. Sugar Creek, a BDA habitat there, water retained on the landscape, and here are some of the fish in early July, our first sampling season. We have, pretty good, nice distribution as compared to the fish trying to rear in this drought, reduced flow.
Yep, 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks. And we have very small juveniles, so think about the success of one fish versus the other fish. Here is, again, here's the fish in those constrained habitats, just tons of them caked up on each other, and they're not going to do well. And also, there's not much floodplain food availability in that situation. So we go along and we continue to watch those fish through the summer. We're now into January. Those are the same fish. And we see this really tiny, these fish are supposed to go out and migrate in a couple months. And look at those guys. I don't think they're going to be terribly successful. We go into the following year and we see this really weird phenomenon, which is this bunch of big fish, which we then presume are those little tiny fish that held over for an additional year with kind of a interesting life history strategy to overcome those conditions. And they actually even look kind of smolty there in August. So couple last thoughts. We did a habitat restoration project. The fish came in and they just loved it, spawned like heck. We're out there doing our last sampling for the prior year fish, and we see these little tiny guys, and we're going, what the heck are those little fish? And we look at them, and they're fry that have emerged approximately 6 weeks earlier than we're used to seeing them. And so Eric, our fabulous monitoring biologist, looked at the water temperature data. Here's the constructed habitat, and that essentially groundwater fed system there. And the thermal units are much warmer up here in the constructed habitat as compared to Sugar Creek. And he did a calculation of thermal units to get those eggs up, emerged, and swimming around. And it turns out that it's about 6 weeks earlier in this restored habitat. So those little fish will have 6 weeks in order to grow prior to hitting the base flow conditions. So we think that their fitness and survival will be much better. We'll keep you posted. So here is 2024. We had 15 pit-tagged adults, fish that we had tagged as juveniles, returning, which was like, oh, so exciting. And these are those 2-year holdovers that returned. So not only was that strategy successful as a juvenile, but they actually contributed to the adult return. Super exciting. And we also had a 2-year jack. So the coho are showing a lot of life histories diversity that we're really surprised about. And then here were fish that were tagged in French and moved over to sugar and moved to French. So those fish are moving around and redistributing across the habitat if they have access. And my final concluding statement is that fish need water and they need habitat, as do all of us species, including me and my grandchildren.
Yeah, so I am really grateful to be here to start off as I'm in this juncture point in my career. I feel very inspired by all the really cool work I've been seeing so far. I also want to acknowledge that I was like, I feel like maybe more nervous for this talk than I've ever been because I'm at a fisheries conference. There's no fish in the streams I'm going to be talking about. There's several fish barriers. I'm also in the groundwater session. There's not a whole lot of groundwater data. What I do have for you today is a really simple, low-cost data set and hopefully just food for thought on surface water hydrology. And if you still are like, why are you at a fisheries conference? Whatever.
You belong here.
Cool, yeah, so my talk is titled Drivers of Surface Water Response and Persistence in Non-Perennial Stream Network. So non-perennial streams are streams that alternate between flowing and dry states. Here is at a catchment outlet. We've got winter stream flow, a good amount of water there, and then a few short weeks later, completely dried down. And non-perennial streams are often split into 2 different types, also called temporary streams. And in contrast to our perennial systems that are consistent connection with groundwater, intermittent streams have a temporary connection with groundwater at high wetness time periods, and then ephemeral systems are thought to really have very limited groundwater connectivity. And non-perennial streams are ubiquitous. They make up 79% of the US stream lakes. A recent study suggested that over 50% of all stream flow in our major rivers originates in non-perennial stream networks. They provide critical aquatic, riparian, and terrestrial habitat. They contribute to groundwater recharge. I could really go on and on about non-perennial streams. It's just really critical that we understand, given their ubiquity and importance, how these streams function. So one way to study non-perennial systems is at the catchment outlet, like this I depicted in the beginning. There's water in our stream gauge, or it's dry. But if you start walking upstream through a non-perennial stream network, you'll find really complex spatial patterns of water. It's dry for a little while, then you reach a flowing reach, and then it gets dry again. And I'm really interested in understanding why surface water persists in some locations longer than others in these types of systems. So what do we know? There's a basic principle in hydrology that says surface water emerges, is present at the surface when it can no longer be accommodated by the subsurface. What types of things influence that? Well, the subsurface properties are important. Many of you are probably familiar with this figure here from David's paper that's highlighting how rock types have a really strong influence on surface water responses. I'm highlighting two lithologies here, which will become apparent in a moment too. So on one side here, this figure, they're showing how Franciscan or Central Belt melange has thinner critical zones or thin depths to bedrock. This doesn't allow for a lot of water storage. It gets shuttled off to our streams rapidly. You get flashy stream flow, not a lot of base flow. Sedimentary rocks, deeper critical zones, more groundwater storage, more persistent surface water. What else is important? Well, lots of studies have shown there's links between topography and surface water responses. This is because it influences how quickly water is moving through our landscape, and also how much water is being collected upstream and delivered. Which leads me to the other thing, which is, of course, how much water, like the rate and volume of water being put into these systems is really important. So again, topography comes up here because large drainage areas tend to contribute more water to that point on our landscape. And then it plays out at big climate scales across the US. There's a figure here showing USGS stream gauges, and they're colored in by the percentage of the year that there's no surface water. We see in the southwestern US lots of orange, reds, or yellow showing lots of days with no stream flow. And I think this is really, the climate is really important. As a California hydrologist, on this figure here, the purple is showing the change in frequency of these weather whiplash events, highly cited. I'm sure many people have seen this. So we are experiencing and are expected to experience more shifts, more extended periods of drought, and really high intensity rainfall. So we're going to be thinking about all these things: lithology, topography, and precipitation, or lack of precipitation on surface water activation and persistence across a multi-year drought. And we're doing this in a very small catchment. So first thing I want to highlight is this bigger catchment here is North Dark Canyon that a lot of my PhD research is based on, but we're going to be zooming into just this upper 0.25 square kilometer catchment. I want to highlight the rock types here. One side we've got in blue that central belty melange material, and then on the other side is sandstones. A few other things on this map. All the circles are stick sensors. They look like this. They are really small. They're placed on the stream bed. They've got two prongs on the bottom that are just telling us if it's wet or not. If it's submerged in water, is shown here or not. So some of them are on are melange tributaries, and some are sedimentary tributaries. And yeah, we monitored water presence and absence at about like 5 minutes for 3 consecutive years. Okay, so I mentioned this is a drought. Here is cumulative precipitation for 2020, 2021, and 2022 are 3 study years. Regionally, tends to get 670 millimeters. These 3 years was between 500, 550 millimeters. So not a lot of rain. I also wanted to quantify some other metric of dryness, building up like the true catchment storage of the system. We didn't have the data for that, but I did use this cumulative running difference between incoming precipitation, which is shown in blue, and outgoing ET, which is shown in green here. And then the difference between these over time is the in red here, which is also the root zone storage deficit. Familiar with that work. So I'm adding that to the plot. Plot now. In this gray line is that storage deficit value. So the inverse of storage, how much water is lacking. And what I want to highlight here is that while it increases, 1, across our 3 study years, and 2, that this value never reaches 0. So if you're in a deficit, if your business is in a deficit constantly, not great. Here, we're always in pretty dry conditions, but to different degrees throughout the year. Here are our stick sensors, where they're located in the stream network, and now I've colored them in by the percentage of the year that they were active, there was water present. In 2020, we saw these numbers range up to 30% of the year, which is like 105 days-ish at our most persistent locations. In 2021, only 17% of the year, so that's like 60 days. And then in 2022, we only had water for up to 9% of the year, which is like 30 days. And we'll see in a little bit that this isn't 100 straight days. The network is wetting up and drying down several times, which is important. So here I've split the sensors up into their respective lithologies. The persistence, or how long there was water present, this is the y-axis here. Gray is the onset of the drought. Dark blue is year 2, or sorry, well, yeah, 2021, and then light blue is 2022. And we saw that at the onset, we have statistically higher surface water persistence in our sedimentary tributaries than the melange tributaries. But with each year of ongoing drought, the persistence declines in our sedimentary regions and kind of starts looking more and more like our melange regions. So while sedimentary regions were able to kind of have slightly elevated surface water persistence, it's not really enough to overcome these ongoing low rainfall years. Topography, I mentioned at the beginning that this is important for how quickly water moves through the landscape and where it accumulates. So this is a correlation matrix between, let's just focus on this first column here, the percentage of the year, the persistence values for 2020, and then these squares are colored in by the strength of the correlation between was there water there and what's the topography at that location. And we see that there's pretty strong correlations in 2020 between where water was present and what the topography is like. In 2021 though, these are still present, but they've become weaker. And then in 2022, I forgot to mention, the boxes, if they're filled in, that's a significant relationship. If they're empty, it's not significant. So by 2022, there's no significant relationships between our surface water presence and topography. And so basically what I've been saying so far is that the locations that we're able to maintain surface water, our wet locations are drying down, and our dry locations are staying dry. But I felt like I was out on this landscape throughout this time period, and I felt like we were kind of missing some part of the story here. So I mentioned at the beginning that these aren't just wetting up one time our stream, like hydrograph and then drying back down. Here I'm showing a heat map for each sensor is one of these rows here. And then the blue time periods are when water was present, and white is when it was absent. And so we can see it like responds to little rain events. Sometimes we get extended periods of flow, but there's a lot of wet up and dry down. And so I calculated the length and timing of each of these wet up, dry down events, and all the associated climate types of things that I can think of. And you can see there's a lot of little blue rectangles here, so it became kind of a pretty big, messy data set pretty quickly. So I kind of maybe want to apologize for throwing a PCA up on the screen, but I've put it into principal component analysis to kind of reduce some of that complexity and highlight the variations within these data sets. And I'm going to walk us through. So each one of these shapes is one of these little blue rectangles, one flow event. The size of the shape is telling us how long that event was. The color tells us about the day of the year that it occurred on. And events that occurred in 2020 are circles, so onset of the drought, and triangles are 2021, and then squares are 2022. So the next bit will tell us why they are located on the plot in their respective regions. So this is still kind of a lot to take in, so I'm just going to break it down into these different quadrants. So the upper quadrant here that I'm calling Q1 is associated with high cumulative precipitation. This 30-day ET is suggesting it's happening later in our water year, which you can also tell by all the dark blue colors. And then also it's events that are occurring at really low storage deficits. So high catchment storage states up in that quadrant, the opposite in the Q4. And then this green region here, Q2, all of these are pointing at precipitation event characteristics. And then like large, really high intensity rainfall. So what I want to highlight is that events that occurred in 2020, our circles, are almost all located in this high catchment water storage state. So our stream is responding because there's a lot of water being stored in our landscape. We've got a lot of little rain events that have added up and filled up the subsurface. In contrast, in 2022, all of our squares are located really close to our precipitation event characteristics. So surface water response at the end of our drought, or end of our study, is driven by high incoming precipitation. So we're kind of seeing, I'm gonna break this down a little bit more in this slide. What we think we're seeing is kind of a shift in the way our stream is responding or generating surface water. So at the onset of the drought, I'm showing here relative storage, and this bottom panel is showing the probability of prolonged flow. At the onset of the drought, we're starting at decently high storage, as we get rainfall, we're able to bring up storage to some storage kind of threshold that's able to maintain surface water even if it's not raining in that moment. And then as we continue through our drought, it's harder and harder to reach that storage threshold, and we spend a longer portion of the year in these kind of precipitation threshold driven scenarios. So we're only going to get a response if it's raining really hard. So you can kind of think of this as the orange periods are our streams behaving like an ephemeral system, and then in the blue periods it's behaving more like an intermittent system. And I got through that a little quicker than I thought I was going to. A little recap. Well, first of all, this system is really vulnerable to drought conditions. We very rapidly go from 105 days of water to only 30 days of water. And I meant to update that. But basically, like I mentioned at the beginning, rock types and topography do matter for influencing surface water persistence, but it's not really enough, in this system at least, to maintain surface water into dry periods. Not all precipitation is equal in this landscape. Looking at cumulative precipitation throughout the year would not necessarily have brought the same insights. Thinking about how high intensity sporadic rainfall is important for understanding the responses in these systems. And I also am, I think this is important to think about too, because if we only have surface water on the landscape for 30 days or 12 days, is that enough time for reproductive cycle? Like, does that even matter to the creatures that are utilizing these systems for their lifespan? And with that, I want to end with some acknowledgements. I sat on this data set for a little while because I was intimidated by all of those little events. Adam and Margaret really helped me push this along. And this work was all done at Blue Oak Range Reserve, which is a UC natural reserve. And I always want to thank the Zacks out there and honestly all the great work that's happening at the reserve systems pool and all the other folks in the Zimmer Hydrology Lab. And with that, if there's any questions.
Well, good afternoon. I'll try to get everybody to lunch on time if I can, so I will dive right into it. This presentation is a comparison of two pond projects, both meant to enhance stream flows in a small tributary of the Mattole River. And just to orient you, the Mattole River is located kind of south of Eureka, north of Fort Bragg, pretty coastal system, and we are in this Headwaters region here. We'll be comparing flow enhancement approaches using ponds. One of our projects is a groundwater recharge pond with no liner that interacts with the surrounding groundwater, while the second pond is direct flow augmentation using a liner, kind of similar concept to what Joel presented this morning for those who were here for that. Our primary goal with these projects is to enhance the rearing habitat for juvenile salmon and steelhead, especially coho, during the driest part of the dry season. You know, we have a very porous geology and we have great temperatures, great habitat, but we run out of stream flow many summers, and so we're just trying to keep a trickle in there to keep the coho salmon alive during the summer months. Here's a photo of one of our North Fork Lost River ponds. There's two of them. We call this one the North Pond. And there we go, 1.3 million. There's my cue. We're on the right one now. Not 1 million. We recalculated this. 1.3 million gallons for both the ponds and the associated groundwater. The groundwater is kind of, the groundwater is held in this hill slope, upslope of the pond. And yeah, this project's about 1.3 million gallons after evaporation. So that's our kind of like design projected flow benefit that it could achieve. Here's just a quick look at the plan set, and really what I want to show here is that, you know, we're not making like we're not working clay into the pond. We're really working on what we call a cutoff wall. So this feature here along the berm of the pond is really what's supposed to hold water in the pond, and it ties into the hill slope. So on the hill slope there's bedrock, and we're tying the cutoff wall into that bedrock. Oh yeah, one last thing here is that we have a number of wells monitoring around the pond, and we're gonna look at this well up here. This is on the slope uphill of the pond. Maybe about, I don't know exactly, but maybe about 60 feet away it looks like.
It's 30.
30 feet away, thank you. So pre-project, we're looking at our well levels here. We'll look at the blue line is pre-project well elevations, and you can see how flashy it is. It also shows you how our geology is just super well drained, so it just yo-yos up and down with rain events. Post-project is the orange line, and you can see that it pretty much hugs very, very closely with our pond level, which is the green line. So, you know, there's great connectivity between the pond and the groundwater well near the pond. And we'll get into some of the results here in a moment, but I'll say that some of the benefits of this style of project, unlined groundwater connected ponds, are that there's potential for really large increases in the groundwater storage capacity, so you can get a lot of flow benefit from groundwater storage and not just the pond. There's no liner, which is very nice. There's less infrastructure and maintenance because all the flow release is passive, and a lot less long-term management, you know, fewer permitting obstacles. There's a lot of desirable traits of this passive release system. The challenges of this kind of system is there's very little control over the timing of the flow benefit. You know, we're trying to save these coho in the peak of summer, and it's very hard to have certainty that your design and your mix, your cutoff walls and everything are going to have the benefit at the intended time period in the middle of summer. And, you know, with these, also with head pressure, the rate of release out of these ponds is highest when the ponds are full, and lower and lower and lower as the pond level drops, right? So your flow benefit is diminishing and diminishing as your pond level goes down. And, you know, it varies in every geologic setting. You know, it's hard to have certainty that your pond's gonna hold water at all. And it can be difficult to measure and quantify impacts. I'm gonna have to speed up here a little bit, but I should say that associated with this pond project, there's also a bunch of channel spanning weirs for 3,000 feet downstream of the project. These are meant to hold water back, slow the declining limb. And so we've also raised the channel bed up to 3 feet in association with these log weirs. And the idea is really to spread the water out and keep it in the upland part of this trib and try to, you know, in an effort to improve the dry season flow. And we think that this 3 feet of raised stream bed holds about 1.6 million gallons of water. And now we'll look at the South Fork Lost River Pond. This one's lined, it's gravel topped, it's metered flow release. I love how simple this system is. This is just, you know, the water comes in here, goes through a flow gauge. Here's how you control the rate of flow. It's on a siphon. So there is almost no maintenance other than, you know, our monitoring crew goes out and makes sure our flow, our rate of release is at the right rate, adjusts if necessary. This line here is just for starting a siphon if you ever need to start it. We're releasing usually about 5 gallons per minute. Last year was the first year of operation, so we're still refining our operation, but it can do up to 7.5. You know, the benefits of this is that we can really, the timing can be targeted to the driest time of the year. We've tried everything. You know, we're an all of the above type organization when it comes to summer stream flow, and it's very hard to get that benefit right in that peak driest time of the year, but this project type does it. You know, the liner makes it very predictable and certain that your pond is going to work. That's nice. You know, the bad parts, the challenges, are that you need to install the plastic liner. Maybe a liner has a lifespan, right? I mean, it does have a lifespan. Hopefully covering it with rock makes that more like 100 years and not like 30 years. But, you know, what's eventually going to happen to these, you know, is a question. There's more infrastructure with infiltration galleries. I should have said this goes into basically a well, and it cools and cleans kind of similarly to Marshall Ranch, but it's really just a vertical perf pipe with sand and gravel around it that then has a sufficiently long flow path to get into the stream to cool and clean through soil. So yeah, there's more infrastructure, pumps, siphons, water meters, all that kind of thing. So here I'm just showing why we use 2016 as a pre-project comparison year, and it's because it's a similar water year to 2024, our only post-project year for which we have data, or our only post-project year. And this is just kind of a map of, you know, here's our North Fork Lost River ponds. We have flow measurements upstream, and then we have flow measurements down here, which is below both our ponds and all that in-stream work. And then here is our lined pond. You know, this is the confluence of North and South Fork Lost River, and then collectively they flow down towards the Mattole here. And we have another measuring point down here in Main Stem Lost River. So here you see that upstream of our North Fork ponds, the unlined groundwater ponds, let's see, if we look at the red dotted line pre-project, you see that our discharge goes down to 0 in September. And you also see, if you look at our green line, that downstream goes dry first. So it was a losing reach pre-project. Over here in post-project, you see that both, you know, let's see, so upstream went to 0. It was a little bit different of a water year. It was the closest one we had. But you can see that the green, that it's actually become a gaining reach. So our project was definitely able to turn it from a losing reach into a gaining reach. And looking at the data a little more, you know, here's our pre-project flows at the downstream end. And you can kind of see where it goes to 0 here. And post-project, you can see that our flow benefit, 60 gallons a minute compared to 22.9, we're gaining a lot of flow benefit in June, in late June. And that goes down, you know, and we're like hopeful it's gonna stay up, and then it gets down into this really, you know, 3 gallons, 4 gallons, 3 gallons. That's not as much as we were hoping for, but it's a lot better than, you know, pre-project. And in the peak of the dry season, our flow got all the way down to 1 gallon. So both those ponds and all of our in-stream were only able to achieve 1 gallon per minute of flow in the peak of the dry season. In this channel, we think that 5 gallons a minute is really what is required to maintain surface connectivity in most of the habitat reaches. Then you see, this is our metered flow. Now this is our stream flow just downstream of our metered pond release. And you know, you can see that we are adding a substantial amount of water compared to what our whole North Fork project was able to do. And that combined, they were able to produce the 5 gallons a minute. And so what I really notice here is that I don't like plastic liners either, but our metered pond was really able to do 4 times the flow benefit in the driest time part of the year, even though our other, our groundwater recharge ponds provide a lot more flow benefit in the June and the shoulder seasons. Let's see. So we think that the total flow benefit over the season was 1.6 million gallons above pre-project. So the benefit was, 1.6 million. And you can really see it in the stream bed. Here's 2 photos. I just love this. This is why we do this kind of work right here. And pre-project, October 5th, 2016, bone dry in our downstream main stem reach. And similar date, 2024 post-project, and there's still this kind of probably 3.5 gallons per minute flowing over bedrock at our measuring station. This is enough to keep our coho salmon alive. Basically, here we are saying that, so we had an actual measurement of 1.6 million gallons above pre-project. Where's our other 1.2 million gallons that we calculated should be in the system? Well, some of it is before we start measuring flows, so our pond didn't stay full as long as we wanted, so some of it leaked out prior to our measuring season, and then there was a balance left in the ponds. And it's kind of an art of, with these flow releases, it's kind of an art of releasing as much as possible while also protecting against a really long, dry fall where you could run out of water, and you don't want to run out of water. Oh, I didn't know I was going to do that. So groundwater, again, groundwater recharge, unlined ponds, biggest flow benefit, not in the driest time of the year. Direct flow augmentation provides it right when you need it the most. And this is a cool thing, the 2 methods aren't mutually exclusive. So if I had like my ideal pond, it would probably be unlined and it would have some passive release, but it would have enough left in it during the dry season that you could make a metered flow release and kind of combine both the strategies in one pond. That would be very cool. Maybe we'll try it. And another thing with so when you think about like our cutoff wall in the pond, like the wall that we construct to hold water in our groundwater recharge pond, you don't actually need surface water to do that. So we have another project we're trying right now. It's a pilot project, experimental, where we're, essentially building this cutoff wall, but we're just going to hold groundwater. We're trying to make a man-made aquifer, essentially. So that's one point, is that you don't really need the pond in this method of groundwater flow augmentation. And thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions.
Welcome, everybody. I realize that we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to jump right in. I might have to skip through some things a little faster than I had originally planned, but I am going to be here at lunch and happy to talk to you after, and I actually have some more details printed that might be helpful if you have questions about some of the science I'm going to get into. So I'm going to be talking about the well ordinance update that we've undertaken in Santa Cruz County. We're about 2 years into the process now. The plan is for the updated codes to go into effect on July 1st. We're just awaiting Coastal Commission approval at this point. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about water use in Santa Cruz County. That's where we are right now. Santa Cruz isn't connected to any of the state or federal water projects, so all of our water here is locally derived. We get it primarily from groundwater. 75% of the water used by people in Santa Cruz County comes from groundwater. The rest of it's surface water with a small amount of recycled water for irrigation purposes. Of the way the water is used, it's about split between domestic and commercial and agriculture. Domestic wells make up about 5% of the water used in the county, but it does weigh heavily into the conversations we're going to have about the policy that we developed. So what role does the county play in groundwater management? It's more than just permitting wells. It's a bigger than that. So we develop policies around well construction and destruction, and that's to make sure that you don't have a well that becomes a conduit for contamination of the groundwater. We also permit individual water systems and small water systems to make sure that they are providing enough water and of good quality for the people who are relying on it. We permit the large water system wells as well, and we deal with water waste and prohibitions on water waste. We also work with our partners in the city, so something people don't understand about permitting is that every jurisdiction has the ability to do it. So while there's 58 counties in California, there can be far, far, far more well permitting processes because cities can take it on. The state can have their own, the feds can have their own, tribes can have their own. So it really is kind of a patchwork of how this is implemented statewide. But counties do have that authority. We also have authority over water quality when it comes to groundwater through our septic system monitoring and maintenance requirements and our hazardous materials program. And then we're also a member of 2 groundwater sustainability agencies in the county, and we work really closely with the 3rd. So, you know, sort of trying to take a more holistic look at management. So this is Santa Cruz County. This is a shot from our well database. We do try to track wells that have gone into the ground. Obviously, some of them go back, you know, almost a century. We do have wells going back that people are still using from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and we don't have a lot of information on them. But we've tried to really improve our tracking over the last decade or so, and currently we know of about 9,000 wells in the county. And as you can see, they sort of span the entire geography. Aside for these are all areas that are in state park ownership, so not a lot of wells up there. But to the point Monty was making earlier, and to the reason why I'm presenting to this group today, there is that connection between groundwater and surface water, at least in parts of the county. And we have salmonid bearing streams, we have Coho, and we have Steelhead in Santa Cruz, and we are very dedicated and committed to try to not only maintain the populations we have, but hopefully increase and restore some of that. Which is why it's really critical that we take a good look at how any actions and activities that can impact stream flow are being considered. I was told by a friend that I needed to make sure I put at least one fish picture in my presentation. So there it is. This is from our monitoring. We do, one of the roles the county plays is overseeing monitoring of steelhead and coho, working with our partner agencies in the county every fall. So when I talk about a well ordinance, I realize that this audience might not know what I'm talking about. I've actually given this presentation to counties, and they're all like into the bureaucracies of it. But the policies that I'm talking about are basically the laws that go into our county code. So, you know, one cool thing about working for government is if there's a law that you see that isn't working, you can change it. And so that's what we're kind of doing here. We were looking at what our policies were about well permitting and what wasn't working, and then we changed it. So we oversee, there's sort of 2 chapters in our code that we're talking about. One is about where you put a well, like if you want to put a hole in the ground, what are the standards by which you have to meet? And the other is if you're using that hole in the ground to serve water to people, what additional requirements are there? So if you're ever wanting to look this up, those are the sections of our county code that you would go to. So before I talk about what we changed, it was really important to just understand what our current status was when it comes to well permitting. So we went through our records and took a look at well permitting here in the county. This is really critical, and it is different than you'll see in other counties, and it shaped a lot of our decision making. So while a lot of what we did here, I do think can be used as sort of a template for other places, there is a lot that's site specific, and that's got a lot to do with us being fairly built out in our rural areas. So we only issue about 45 permits per year for wells, and of those, most of them are de minimis, which about 80%. We define de minimis wells as a domestic use, less than 2 acre-feet a year, and with no more than a ½ acre of irrigated landscaping. So that was how we defined de minimis. About 80% of the wells that we issue permits for are de minimis. So we're talking about a household, or maybe a shared well that's got up to 4 households on it in the rural parts of the county. We also have replacement wells. So that's when you had a well, you're going to replace it. You're going to do like for like. It's going to be the same kind of general depth, and it's going to be for the same use. So it's basically, those are usually pretty straightforward. Supplemental wells are when you, sometimes in areas of the county, you get declining productivity of your wells, and the supplemental well is put in to just make sure that you can continue to do what you were doing, but you're not increasing your water use. If there's an increase, or if it's a new water use, that's considered a new well. Again, we only issue an average of 10 new well permits a year, and usually 9 of those are de minimis. So we don't have a lot of big new water uses going in, and that is important to understand for the rest of the policy. Other things to know, we also have really strict land use policies around growth in these rural areas. So we're not permitting large subdivisions in the mountains on wells. That's not happening here. There's also, this is an area, really prime agriculture. It's been farmed for well over a century. Any land that is going to be farmed has pretty much been in production since the 1940s or earlier. So that's also important to know. We aren't seeing a lot of new ag going in. We do see changes in crops that are being used, and that can result in a larger water use. We also have a lot of information on how much water our de minimis wells are using. We don't meter them, but we do have a lot of water systems that are very similar that are metered. And so we used a ½ acre-foot as a household standard, but realistically, it's more like half of that in the areas that we do have metered. We don't have a lot of landscaping in our rural areas. It's hard to put a lawn under a redwood tree, and so it's just not very common around here. A couple other things to know. Our groundwater levels have been either in a steady state or even increasing throughout most of the county for the last 15 years. We have a lot of monitoring of our groundwater here, and so we know that that is the case. That's also very different than a lot of other parts of the state. And I always like to talk about our special geology because it makes it really hard to make any assumptions about, and also to make any sort of blanket rules for Santa Cruz County. We have stacked aquifers, we have fractured rock, we have all sorts going on here. We've got seawater, so it's just, it is really complicated. So, why did I put myself through the last 2 years of challenges? It was because we have not updated our well policy since 2009, but the world has continued to move and change, and so our well policy didn't take into account the groundwater sustainability agencies and their mandate to provide sustainable groundwater. And yet they're not doing the permitting, so it's really important that there is a relationship there. Some other state laws, Senate Bill 552 is really looking at drought resilience in domestic wells and maybe not putting wells in areas where wells are actively going dry, so more consideration about water supply. Well interference has gotten a lot more attention from the state. There was an executive order that came out a few years ago trying to make sure that we aren't dewatering, especially domestic wells, by allowing larger capacity wells to go in right next to them. We also have, and I'm sure many of you are aware about ongoing case law regarding well permitting and both CEQA and just making sure that you're preserving public trust values. And we also have plans that have gone in place over the last 15 years. Our climate action plan, our drought response plan. We got a letter in 2022 from the National Marine Fisheries Service indicating that they had concerns that because our existing process was ministerial, which means they didn't need to undergo CEQA to get a well permit, that we might be creating, we might not be being protective enough. So as we decided to embark on this update, we enlisted the help of very, very smart people who volunteered their time to make sure that we were doing the right thing. So this is our technical advisory committee. We met 4 times for basically, we called them meetings, but they were really workshops. These were 3 hours long, intensive conversations about every topic related to the update. So we had a mix. We had agriculture, both large and small, represented. We had well drillers who understand the geology of the county better than anybody else. We had our water advisory commissioners, we had our groundwater sustainability agencies, and we had resource agencies at the table, as well as the Department of Water Resources, because I wanted them to understand what this looks like to do this right. They have been working on their policy since 2012, and it still has not been updated yet. Last I heard was 2026 is the estimated time frame. So, now I'm going to get a little bit into the science. So the title of my talk is When Science Meets Policy, and this is, the science is, I think, what a lot of you are familiar with, and you know, there's great value in the research we did, so we're going to focus on that first. So right now when you talk about ministerial approval, so that's basically an approval of a well permit without it having to go through its own CEQA process. We're basically concerned about a couple of things, one mainly being streamflow depletion. So here's some graphics here about how streamflow depletion works. You know, you put your well in and it starts pulling not only from the groundwater but also from the stream. And one small domestic well is probably not going to have any measurable impact, but a really large ag well or a couple dozen domestic wells, you could start to see some significant impacts that could dewater these streams during the fall, summer and fall when things are the hottest. So in order to think about, well, what are the mechanisms that you have when you're only really able to impact somebody's ability to put the hole in the ground, right? You're just only permitting the construction of the well. Your tools are really distance, so setbacks from the creeks or from other wells, and also a well seal, which this is a schematic basically. The seal is what blocks off water from upper levels in the aquifer, the ones most interconnected from the streams, from getting into where the water is being pulled from here at the bottom. So those are really the 2 mechanisms that you have. Oh, 5 minutes? Oh my goodness. Okay. So we did a lot of sensitivity analysis. Like I said, we have a lot of different aquifer types. So we looked at every aquifer type in the county and stacked aquifers, and we looked at various different seal depths at various pumping rates and distances from the creek. We have 90 pages of analysis that you can look at. It kind of looks like 90 pages of this. To try to figure out where are the sensitivities. You know, if we say you can be 50 feet from a creek, how is that different in terms of the depletion in that creek from being 1,000 feet from that creek? And what if you're pumping 2 acre feet, and what if you're pumping 20 acre feet? So those are sort of we did all of this analysis. We ended up with this massive data set looking at, so this one's looking at setbacks, just purely what difference does it make how far you are from the creek at different well pumping capacities. And what about the seal depth? What if it's shallow, deep? What if it's under a confining layer where we have one, which isn't actually very much of the county? And what if that seal depth is 50, you know, what if it's 200 feet? What if it's 100 feet, but it's 200 feet from the creek? So all of those different scenarios, looking at things beneath an aquitard. So basically we ended up with a massive amount of information about all of these different possibilities. And then we were like, one of my staff was like, so what do we do with all of this? It's like, well, now we have to draw our lines. We have to come up with how we take this information and we implement it. And so we ended up coming up with something that I think was a good compromise between making it easy enough for a person who has a house and they have a family and they're on a well and their well went dry. We can't make that person wait 6 months to get a new well. They don't have water, they don't have wastewater, they don't have showers if they don't have a well. So we can't make it too hard. But also, we can't make it too easy. We need to make sure that we're being protective when necessary. So we developed a tiered system, tiers 1 through 4, for well permits. So a tier 1 is a domestic well. We don't make them do a lot more than they had to before. But a tier 4 well, that's a large new use of water, that's gonna have to go through a significant analysis. I'm gonna just sort of skip ahead. One of the main pieces of what I think really worked in the architecture of our plan is understanding that things are going to change and we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We put a lot of the more challenging pieces, a lot of the more nuanced parts where we know that we don't have all the information yet. We put that into policy instead of into the code. The difference is that the code is a huge process to update. It takes a couple years. You have to go to the Board of Supervisors. You have to go to the Coastal Commission. It is a massive undertaking, and it's expensive, and it takes all your time away from actually doing good work. So putting the more detailed information in policy allows you to make changes more nimbly as better information becomes available. As new wells are going in, you can sort of update things without having to update your entire code. So we're hoping that that allows this to be a little bit more resilient and nimble. So this is one of the things that comes into the policy, is basically we drew those lines. We said, okay, if you're a small well, you need to be 50 feet from other wells. You need to be 50 feet from, 50 feet from a stream with a 100-foot seal if you are within the 1,000 feet of the stream. So we basically drew these lines. Where it starts getting a little bit more complicated is for newer wells that are going to be using more than 2 acre-feet a year but less than 50. We created an entire process, and I really want to thank everybody from this community who helped us identify what is a streamlined way that we can issue these permits while still doing enough analysis to make sure we're being protective. And we came up with this critical stream. So this is a list of all of our salmon-bearing streams in the county. And in each of them, we issued a resource value based on if they're supporting coho, steelhead, are they used for rearing, etc. We looked at unimpaired flows to the best of our ability. We looked at current flows, everything that we know. We estimated the current depletion, and this is really getting to the existing cumulative impacts of well permitting and surface water diversions as well. So what are the existing current depletions taking place in these critical streams? This is our data sources. What additional allowable depletion can we allow without having to make someone go through an entire CEQA process? And you know, that's what those numbers are. And so it's actually not very hard using existing online models, USGS, to do these calculations based on the well specs that have been applied for. And this, again, can be updated as new information becomes available. We don't need to wait 10 years to do a big code update to update this table if we have new wells going in or if we find that we were wrong about some of our assumptions. So this is the website. I would encourage anybody who's interested in this to check it out. So all of our documents, we documented everything, all of the analysis we did, all of the decisions we made are documented in this list of documents here. And you know, feel free to take a look and you can contact me if you have questions. The code itself is also there. And then that's a QR code that takes you just to the website so that you can get to them. Okay, I sped through it. we have time for questions?
Yeah, that's good.